fatigue is a peculiarity of the English village that it will suffer almost any eccentricity from its inhabitants, so long as those inhabitants are sufficiently well established and, if possible, dead. The living eccentric is a nuisance. The dead one is a legend. Mr. Cornelius Vane, late organist and campanologist of the parish of St. Anselm the Less in Tollington Parva, had achieved the latter distinction rather more abruptly than the village had anticipated, a circumstance which might have passed unremarked had he not done so in the belfry at 11:30 on a Tuesday morning, with the bells still swinging overhead and the chancel key missing from his waistcoat pocket. Lord Peter Wimsey arrived on the Wednesday in a cream-colored motor car that deposited him before the Leach Gate with a sound he described as a satisfied sigh, like a man who has made a good investment. He wore a suit of pale gray herringbone, carried a Malacca cane he had no intention of leaning upon, and was followed at 3 paces by Mervyn Bunter, whose expression conveyed, as it always did, that he was simultaneously prepared for a murder, a garden party, or a small diplomatic incident. Inspector Gregson of the County Constabulary met them at the gate. He was a large, conscientious man with the aspect of a Methodist deacon who suspects his congregation of backsliding. He had already formed a view of the matter and wore it visibly in the manner of a man proud of new galoshes. "Good of you to come, my lord. I think we can have this wrapped up by evening." The sexton found him at 11:43. Death by strangulation, the doctor says, somewhere between 10 and 11.
This, Wimsey, it means
the
I
bell
was right
rope
about
used.
Croft.
We have a
He
very
poisoned
promising
the
suspect. Splendid, said Wimsey pleasantly. I do enjoy a promising suspect. They are so rarely the right one. Gregson blinked. We have motive, opportunity, and the widow confirms he was the last man seen with the deceased. The widow, said Wimsey, who had paused to read the war memorial beside the gate, confirms nothing of the sort, Inspector, since a widow is by definition a partial witness. She also, one notes, confirms it rather quick. Bunter, the memorial. Something's wrong with it. Bunter examined the stone tablet with the attentiveness he reserved for port wine and suspicious footprints. The final name, my lord, Patay, G. Aldous Vane, 1916. The lettering is slightly newer than the surrounding names. Added afterwards, one would say, at some interval. Yes, said Wimsey, with the tone of a man who has just seen something at auction he intends to purchase. Yes, I rather thought so. Shall we go in? The bell rope is a fine instrument of murder in theory. In practice, it has a great disadvantage. It remains attached to the bell. A man wishing to commit a discreet crime in a belfry is, one might say, at the mercy of acoustics. Lord Peter Wimsey, en route to the vestry, the Church of St. Anselm. The Less was of the perpendicular persuasion, which is to say it admitted light grudgingly and theology with some suspicion. The belfry was accessed through a narrow door behind the organ loft, a door which, Gregson explained, had been found unlatched but not open, and which possessed a lock of the sort that could be turned from either side with a single key. The body of Mr. Cornelius Vane had been removed, but the scene retained its eloquence. A length of bell rope, severed at a point some 4 feet above the cleat, lay coiled in the corner, with a purposeful neatness that struck Wimsey immediately. Who coiled it? Gregson frowned. Nobody. That's how it was found. Wimsey walked around it twice as though it were a piece of modern sculpture he had not yet decided whether to like. Curious. Bell ropes, when severed under tension, do not coil themselves. They fall. Someone coiled it after the fact. Either the murderer, who would be in a considerable hurry, or a third party who prefers tidiness to evidence. Your sexton, Inspector, is he a tidy man? Gregson's face underwent the particular expression of a man who has failed to ask an obvious question.
A perfect rhythm.
I didn't think to.
Ceaseless.
Quite,
and loud.
said Wimsey kindly. One
Yet the
rarely
dictaphone
does
heard
with
nothing.
sextons. Bunter, I should like photographs of the cleat, the rope end, the latch mechanism, and those marks on the west wall, there, below the window, before the light shifts. Also, if you could make inquiries of the vicar's housekeeper as to the precise schedule of the morning's bell practice, I should be grateful. I shall be examining the organ. The organ, my lord, said Gregson, with the tone of a man to whom this represented an irrelevance bordering on the eccentric. The organ, confirmed Whimsy serenely. Mr. Vane was its keeper for 31 years. A man's organ will tell you rather more about him than his widow will, and considerably more than his solicitor. Also, I note that the pipe nearest the chancel arch has been recently, if incompetently, retuned. In a church where the organist was murdered this morning, I find that mildly suggestive. He may find it otherwise. We shall see who is right. Cornelius Edmund Vane, B., 14th of March, 1871, Ipswich. Appointed parish organist, 1901, served continuously.
Where were you?
Fellow, Royal College of Organists. Unmarried, no issue. Estate to be determined pending probate. Next of kin declared Mrs. Helena Vane, widow of his brother G.A. Vane, D. France, 1916. Keyholder, Belfry, C. Vane, Seoul. Last bell practice logged. Tuesday, 9:45 a.m., 10:30 a.m. Whimsy read this document, which Bunter had obtained from the vestry register, with the expression he reserved for detective novels he had not written, which was to say, attentively, and with faint, professional envy.
We found the bitten cigar.
He read it twice. Then he placed it flat on the organ bench beside him, and played 3 notes on the instrument which boomed softly through the empty nave. Bunter, my lord. The key to the belfry was not on the body. It has not been found elsewhere in the church. The sole key holder was the deceased.
I believe this belongs
you
to
will
one
observe
of you.
that the door was found unlatched, which is consistent with the murderer having departed. But the door was also not found open, which suggests the murderer had the presence of mind to pull it shut behind them. You cannot pull a spring-latch door fully shut from the outside without the key. Bunter's face exhibited the calm satisfaction of a man who has seen a thing confirmed that he had privately suspected.
Bank is calling in your markers,
Then the
Geoffrey.
key must
Where did
still
the money
be
go?
inside the tower,
know,
my
Whimsy, I
lord.
swear.
Or there is
It
a
just
second
vanished.
key the inspector has not accounted for. Or, said Whimsy, striking the retuned pipe's corresponding note again, the murderer was never outside at all.
I
He
couldn't
stood
stop him.
straightened.
He said
His
he would ruin the
waistcoat
family if I
picked
didn't
up the
comply.
Malacca cane
He
and
hid the
permitted
jewels
himself the smallest of smiles. The
Gentlemen,
sort that Bunter
if you are
had come
listening
to
to this, it means
associate
my
with
suspicions
7-letter
were
words
correct,
in
and
crossword
one of you
puzzles,
is a killer.
and with the opening
Debts
movements of
and
things that would
shame.
become considerably more complicated before they became simple again. Come, he said. I believe the vicar is expecting us for elevances, and I should very much like to hear his account of the Sunday sermon before last. Specifically, the text he chose. In my experience, clergymen who are about to be inconvenienced by a murder
curious
in their
arrangement,
belfry
Inspector.
invariably
Clearly set
preach
up
on
for
the
a
theme of
left-handed
concealment
gentleman.
rather sooner
A
than the
forgotten
occasion
detail, but
strictly
quite
demands.
significant.
Inspector, Gregson followed them out, with the look of a man who has been handed a puzzle when he came for a solution. Which is, perhaps, the most accurate description of how any encounter with Lord Peter Whimsy tends to conclude. The vicar of St. Anselm, the less was a man constructed, it appeared, entirely from apology. He apologized for the smallness of his study, for the inadequacy of his biscuits, for the death of his organist, and, with particular feeling, for the behavior of his cat, which had stationed itself upon Lord Peter Whimsy's hat and showed no inclination to vacate. Remarkable animal, said Whimsy, retrieving the hat without rancor and examining the impression left upon the brim. Decisive.
timing of the pudding,
I admire
Dawkins.
that in a cat.
Precisely where were
The
you
Reverend
when it
Arthur
was
Phelps
served?
was perhaps 60,
I want the truth.
with the complexion of a man who spent considerable time outdoors worrying about things he could not alter, in the eyes of one who had, at some point in his career, seen rather more of human
Because it's the
nature
truth.
than his theological training
I finished
had
my
prepared
duties
him
and went
for.
straight to my
He
room.
poured tea with the slightly excessive concentration of a man grateful for an occupation. Mr. Vane, he said, was not, that is to
Look
say,
closely
he
at
was a
this
most
detail
accomplished
right here.
musician. But, said Whimsy
So
pleasantly,
the alibi is
I beg your
worthless.
pardon?
He's lying.
You paused before accomplished. In my experience, a pause of that particular duration before a compliment indicates that the compliment is the entirety of what one intends to say, and that what one has decided not to say would fill the remainder of the afternoon. The Reverend Phelps set down his cup. Outside, a wood pigeon delivered its opinion of the situation at some length. He was a private man, the vicar said at last. He had arrangements. I did not inquire into them. Sensible policy for a clergyman, and Mrs. Helena Vane, she calls upon you. She worships here, yes, has done since her husband's death. She assists with the altar flowers. Conscientiously? The vicar blinked. I'm sorry, the flowers, vicar. Does she arrange them with the meticulous attention of a woman who has very little else to occupy her, or with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has rather too much? A pause of some significance. The latter, I should say. And she and Mr. Cornelius Vane, the relationship was cordial? Entirely proper, said the vicar, with the speed of a man who has rehearsed the phrase. Whimsy smiled and said nothing, which was, Bunter had long observed, considerably more effective than any question.
That doesn't make any sense.
They disagreed, the vicar admitted.
These figures don't match
On a matter of the estate, Cornelius held the house in trust, left so by his brother for
Where were you
Helena's
when the body
use
was
during
found?
her lifetime.
Right here, scrubbing the
There was
pots
some
like
question
always.
recently of Cornelius wishing to sell. A developer from Ipswich made an offer. Helena she expressed herself strongly. I imagine she did. Whimsy set
As I
down his
recall,
own
the
cup
pudding
and
was
stood.
served precisely
One further
at
thing,
8:15.
your sermon the Sunday before last. The text? The Reverend Phelps looked for just a moment rather pale. Ecclesiastes, he said quietly. There is no new thing under the sun. Quite so.
Look at the escapement, Inspector.
Thank you, Vicar.
Perfect synchronization,
The biscuits
yet
were
utterly
excellent.
complex. The
They had
murderer's
not
plan
been.
mirrors this mechanism
The widow
exactly.
received them in the parlor of Vane House, which was the sort of room that had once been fashionable and had since become determined. The furniture was good but aggressively arranged, every chair at a precise angle, every
swear, Sir
surface
Roderick, it
bearing
wasn't
exactly one object more than it required. A woman's room, Whimsy thought, not in the domestic sense, but in the sense of a room that had been controlled for a very long time by someone who had very little else
It was
to
you,
control.
wasn't it, Joffrey?
Mrs.
You arranged
Helena
the
Vane was
accident.
53 and handsome in the manner of a woman who had been beautiful at 30 and had decided, with some deliberation, to become formidable instead. She wore black.
So, the
Though
truth
whether this
emerges from the
represented
shadows.
genuine mourning
The
or
murderer,
the wardrobe of
Inspector,
a woman who had
is
been
Silas
quietly
Croft.
preparing for
We know
her
it was you,
brother-in-law's death
The game
was a question
is up.
Whimsy filed away with several others. She did not offer tea. I have already spoken to the inspector, she said, at considerable length. I know, said Whimsy warmly. He told me you were most helpful. I shan't detain you. I have only 2 or 3 entirely irrelevant questions. And then Bunter and I will leave you in peace and bother someone considerably less composed. The compliment, or what passed for one, did its work. Mrs. Helena Vane settled fractionally into her chair. You were at home yesterday morning? Whimsy asked. I was. My housekeeper, Mrs. Dodd, can confirm it. I'm sure she can. And you last saw Mr. Vane, Cornelius, I mean, not your late husband. When? Monday evening. He came to dinner. We discussed the house. Amicably, a pause of precisely the wrong length. Adequately. He wished to sell. You did not. This house, said Mrs. Helena Vane, with a quietness that was more alarming than volume, is all that remains of my husband's family. George died in France. Cornelius inherited everything, managed it badly, and then proposed to dispose of what little was left to a man who builds seaside hotels. I objected. Naturally, and the trust. I believe it secured your residence here for the duration of your lifetime. It did. However, she stopped. However, Whimsy agreed, as though she had completed the sentence. Cornelius had located a clause, or claimed to have done. His solicitor wrote to me 3 weeks ago. Something about a condition of continuous occupancy. I don't recall the precise language. But you found it alarming enough to recall that it existed. For the first time, something shifted behind her eyes. Not guilt, precisely, but the recognition that she was speaking to a man who was not, as she had initially supposed, merely decorative. I found it inconvenient, she
The
said
drop is
carefully.
compromised.
Whimsy
saw
stood
Malone
and
watching the
retrieved his
docks.
hat from beneath his arm.
Get Malone.
One last thing, Mrs. Vane.
You get the ledger?
The bell rope in the tower. Did your brother-in-law ever mention having it repaired? In recent weeks, say? She frowned, and the frown was entirely genuine. No. Why should he mention it to me? No reason at all, said Whimsy pleasantly. Good afternoon. On the path outside, Bunter fell into step beside him without being summoned. She's lying, my lord, but not, I think, about the murder. No, said Whimsy, not about the murder, about something rather older, which is, of course, considerably more interesting. The sexton of Saint. The less was named Horace Pell, and he was the sort of man who made tidiness into a moral position. He kept the churchyard with the zeal of a curator and the precision of a mathematician. Headstones aligned, gravel raked to a consistency that suggested he owned a very small ruler and consulted it frequently. He had worked at the church for 38 years, which meant he had outlasted 4 vicars, 2 organists, and one brief but spirited dispute about the positioning of the font that he still referred to unprompted as the trouble. Whimsy found him in the vestry, doing something meticulous with brass polish and a cloth the size of a handkerchief. Mr. Pell, said Whimsy, settling onto a wooden chair with the ease of a man who has decided to stay. I understand you found the body. At 11:43, said Pell, without looking up. I noted the time. I always note the time. An admirable habit. And you entered the belfry how? Door was unlatched. I pushed it open. A pause of professional
The senator was
satisfaction.
absolutely
I'd been in at
charmed
9:30 to check the ropes.
Did you hear about
Before
Sam?
practice.
Oh,
That's my
darling,
routine.
let's not discuss
The
that
ropes
now.
were all intact at
So you were saying
9:30.
you left the house at
They
precisely
were.
10
I
past.
check
When
every
tomorrow?
Tuesday. Have done for 38 years. And the door was latched at 9:30. Pell looked up for the first time. He had the eyes of a man who notices things and has never
It's
once
over,
been
Weg.
asked about it. Latched
Tell
and
me where
locked.
you hid it.
Mr. Vane's key was in it inside. He sometimes left it so when he didn't want interrupting during practice. Whimsy absorbed this with an expression of mild interest entirely at odds with its significance. He practiced alone? No assistant? No pupil? Not for the past year. He had a pupil until last spring.
Get me central
Young
booking on
Alderton
the double.
from the farm. Then that stopped.
DA isn't gonna like
Stop
this,
how?
Mike.
Tell him I
Pell
don't care.
returned
We
to his
haven't done
brass
the
work.
rights.
Abruptly.
It's concluded,
Whimsy
sir.
allowed the
Everything
word
you
to
need
stand
is
in the room
inside.
for a moment, where it occupied rather more space
Good
than
work.
its 2 syllables warranted. Mr. Pell, the bell rope that was used. When I examined it, it had been coiled quite neatly. Did you coil it? The sexton's cloth paused its rotation. I straightened it when I came in and saw what I saw. I straightened it. Instinct. Of course. And the key. Was it in the door when you entered at 11:43? It was not. You are quite certain. I note these things. You do, said Whimsy approvingly. Tell me the marks on the west wall of the belfry below the lancet window. How long have they been there? Pell set down the candlestick he had been polishing. The question had landed somewhere unexpected, and he was a man who did not like the unexpected. It disturbed the geometry of things. 6 weeks, he said at last. Perhaps 7. I intended to report them to Mr. Vane, but did not. He'd have wanted to know how they got there, and I wasn't. Pell stopped, resumed. I wasn't certain I could answer that without mentioning something else. Something else, Whimsy repeated pleasantly. He crossed one leg over the other, examined the tip of his shoe, and waited with the patience of a man who has all afternoon and finds the conversation rather better than he had anticipated. I think, Mr. Pell, you had better mention it now, to me rather than the inspector, who is between us, somewhat less discreet. The sexton looked at his cloth, looked at the candlestick, looked briefly at the door, as though calculating whether departure was a viable option, and concluded correctly that it was not. Someone had been using the belfry, he said quietly, at night. I don't know who. But they came in through the lancet. There's a ledge if you know it's there, and they came more than once. The marks on the wall are rope marks, different rope, not a bell rope. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a detail that has just ceased to be irrelevant. "Mr. Pell," said Whimsy, standing and buttoning his coat, "you have been extraordinarily helpful. I wonder, did you mention any of this to Mrs. Helena Vane?" The sexton's expression answered before his words did. "She asked me," he said, "not to." Whimsy spent the remainder of the afternoon doing what Inspector Gregson would have described, with some frustration, as nothing in particular. He walked the perimeter of the churchyard twice, measured something near the vestry wall, with a length of string he produced from his coat pocket, with the casualness of a man who considers string a reasonable thing to carry, and stood for 11 minutes. Bunter counted, beneath the lancet window of the belfry, looking upward with an expression of serene calculation. He then walked to the village post office, sent 2 telegrams, purchased a quantity of barley sugar he did not appear to want, and spent 20 minutes in conversation with the postmistress about the history of campanology in Suffolk, during which he extracted, without appearing to ask for it, that Cornelius Vane had received a registered letter from a London address 3 weeks prior, had signed for it with visible agitation, and had stood outside the post office for some time afterwards, reading it repeatedly in the manner of a man hoping the contents might improve upon rereading. They had not apparently done so. Back at the inn, a low-ceilinged establishment called the Crossed Keys, which smelled of hops and philosophical resignation. Bunter spread the photographs across the table with the methodical care of a man laying out evidence at the Last Judgment. Whimsy studied them in silence, moving occasionally between them with one finger, as though conducting a very slow and private orchestra. "The rope end," he said at last. "The cut. Clean, my lord. A single stroke, a blade of some sharpness. Not scissors, not a penknife, something longer." He tapped the photograph. "And the angle of the cut is downward, left to right. Our murderer is right-handed, moderately tall, and cut the rope before the strangulation, not after, which means the rope was prepared in advance, and the meeting in the belfry was not accidental." Bunter placed a second photograph beside the first. "The marks on the west wall, my lord. I took the liberty of measuring the spacing." Whimsy looked. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes became very still, in the manner of a compass needle settling to north. "A ladder," he said quietly. "Not climbing, lowering. Someone lowered something through the lancet window. Something heavy enough to leave compression marks at regular intervals against the stone." He stood and moved to the window of the inn, looking out toward the church tower, which was faintly visible above the elm trees in the fading afternoon light. "What does one lower from a belfry window at night, Bunter? That one cannot carry through the door. Something one does not wish to be observed carrying, my lord." "Precisely. Something," or he paused. "Someone." He turned from the window. "The telegrams will answer by morning. Until then, I want the full history of the trust document on Vane House. Specifically, any amendments made in the last 5 years, and everything the county record office holds on a private G. Aldous Vane, died France, 1916. Regimental details, letters whether a body was ever formally repatriated." Bunter's pen did not hesitate. "And if it was not, my lord?" Whimsy unwrapped a piece of barley sugar with some deliberation. "Then our dead man has been considerably more active than is generally considered decent for a corpse." He moved back to the photographs. Also young Alderton, the farm, the pupil whose lessons stopped abruptly last spring. "I want to know why they stopped, and I want to know it before Gregson thinks to ask." He picked up the photograph of the bell rope again, held it to the lamp, and studied the cut end with the focused attention generally reserved for incunabula and very good clarity. "The chronology is wrong," he said, half to himself. "Everyone has assumed Vane was killed during bell practice because that is when he was found. But practice ended at 10:30. The body was found at 11:43. 73 minutes, Bunter, in a locked belfry, with one key to which only the dead man had access.
A man doesn't usually
He
forget
set the
his cigarette
photograph
case.
down. That is
Especially
not a
not when he's
window of
leaving in a
opportunity.
hurry.
That is a locked
Did you
room.
leave in a hurry,
And
George?
locked rooms are not created by accident. They are created by someone who understands in considerable detail the precise mechanism of the lock. Outside, the church bell rang for evensong. 6 measured strokes that crossed the darkening village and faded into the elms. Whimsy listened to all 6 with his eyes closed. Slight flat on the 5th, he said. Has been for years, I should think. Nobody noticed. He opened his eyes. Rather like everything else in Tollington Parva. A telegram from London arrived at 7 the following morning, and Whimsy read it over casually with the focused tranquility of a man receiving confirmation of something he had already decided to believe. He read it twice, folded it into his breast pocket, and said nothing for the remainder of breakfast, which Bunter correctly interpreted as a sign that the architecture of the thing had become, overnight, considerably more elaborate. The second telegram arrived at 9, from a contact Whimsy maintained at the War Office, whose existence he never explained and whose name he never volunteered. Bunter received it at the door, read it with the expressionless precision of a man trained to absorb surprising information without redistribution of his features, and brought it to Whimsy in the parlor where he sat with the trust documents spread across the table like the evidence of a very dry crime. Whimsy read it, set it flat, looked out the window at the elm trees which were doing nothing in particular. Private George Aldous Vane, he said, was reported missing at the Somme in September 1916. Not killed, missing. The distinction is not merely grammatical. He picked up the telegram again. He was never formally declared dead by the army. The family applied for presumption of death through Sill Channels in 1921. The application was processed by a solicitor in Ipswich.
The drop is
A
compromised.
pause. The same
We have to
firm,
move the
Bunter,
package by
that
dawn.
currently administers the Vane House
your head
Trust.
down.
Bunter set down the coffee pot with great care. Then the trust itself was constructed upon a presumption, not a certainty, which is a very different thing.
50,000, do I hear?
Whimsy stood and moved to the window.
6,000 going
Now,
once,
the
going
registered
twice,
letter Vane
sold.
received 3 weeks
The
ago
bidding is at
from a London
$10,000.
address.
Do I hear
I asked a
11?
contact to
10,000
trace
going
the
once,
sender.
going twice,
It originated from a
sold.
private inquiry agent in Holborn,
50,000,
a
do I
reputable
hear
firm,
60? 60,000
specializing in the
back.
location
Going
of
once,
missing
going
persons and the
twice.
verification of identity claims. The room held this information for a moment in the manner of a space that has just been rearranged and has not yet adjusted to its new dimensions. Someone hired an inquiry agent, Bunter said, to find George Vane, or to confirm that he was findable, which implies he was, in fact, found. Whimsy turned from the window. Consider the trust, Bunter. Helena Vane holds residency for her lifetime as the widow of George Aldous Vane. If George Aldous Vane is not, in the legal sense, dead, if the presumption is overturned, then the trust collapses entirely. The house reverts. Helena loses everything, and more importantly, she loses it not to a developer from Ipswich, but to a living husband who has been, for reasons one does not yet fully apprehend, extremely quiet for 35 years. And Cornelius, said Bunter slowly, knew. Cornelius knew. The letter was addressed to him, not to Helena, which means he had commissioned the inquiry, or received its conclusions, and had not yet decided what to do with them. He was one suspect in the process of deciding when someone decided for him. Whimsy picked up his hat. We are going to visit young Alderton at the farm. The pupil, the lessons that stopped abruptly. He paused at the door. It has just occurred to me to wonder whether the bell practice on Tuesday was logged in Vane's own hand or in someone else's. I noted the register, my lord, when I photographed the vestry. The entry for Tuesday's practice is in a different ink from the surrounding entries. Whimsy smiled slowly, with the particular quality of a man who has been patient for 2 days and is beginning to feel it justified. Different ink, he said, not different handwriting. No, my lord, The handwriting is identical. Which is, said Whimsy, opening the door onto the bright Suffolk morning, either entirely innocuous or the most interesting thing anyone has told me since I arrived in Tollington Parva. I find on consideration that I am not inclined toward the former interpretation. He stepped outside. Come, Bunter, let us go and ruin a farmer's morning.
all due
Alderton's
respect,
farm sat a
Ambassador,
mile east of the
we both
village
know
along a
this
lane that
situation
had
is
not
far
been
more
improved
complicated
since
than
the
the
reign of a
official reports
monarch
suggest.
Whimsy declined to specify, and which
Priority call for the secretary.
expressed its
Yes, hold the
opinions
line,
on
this is
motor
urgent.
traffic through a series of ruts that made the cream-colored car sound, Bunter observed, considerably less satisfied than usual. They left it at the gate and walked the remaining distance,
They found
which
her down by
Whimsy
the
appeared
docks,
to find
Whimsy.
agreeable, and the mud did
She's
not.
gone.
Thomas Alderton was 26, broad-shouldered, and occupied with a fence post when they arrived. A task he continued for slightly longer than courtesy required before setting down his mallet with the deliberateness of a man who has decided that further delay will be interpreted unfavorably. He had the look of someone who had rehearsed a version of this conversation and was unhappy to discover the questions were different. Mr. Alderton, said Whimsy pleasantly, I understand you studied the organ with Mr. Vane until last spring. I should like to know why you stopped. Alderton looked at his hands. We didn't suit, musically or otherwise. A silence that lasted precisely long enough to constitute an answer. He wasn't, he changed. Last year, got secretive, jumpy. I didn't want the trouble. What sort of trouble did you anticipate? The sort, said Alderton
map shows the route
carefully.
through the south
That
zone.
comes from
We
knowing
move the
things you
prisoners
haven't been
tonight.
asked about.
I'll get them out. Be
Whimsy
ready in the
regarded him
rendezvous
with the benign
Right here.
attentiveness he generally
They've
brought
expanded
to
the main hangar
manuscripts in
significantly.
dead languages. Mr.
means they're
Alderton,
preparing for
I
a
am going to
major
tell you
offensive,
something,
Captain.
and I should like you to attend carefully. Inspector Gregson is a thorough man. He will arrive here within the day, possibly two. Once he has finished with his promising suspect and found him insufficiently promising, when he arrives, he will ask you these same questions with considerably less charm, and a constable taking notes. It would be to your very material advantage to have already spoken frankly to someone who has no particular interest in arresting you. The fence post received a long, considering look. Then Alderton sat on the stile and pressed his hands together between his knees. There was a man, he said. I saw him twice, maybe 3 times, near the church, always at night. I was coming back late from, it doesn't matter where, once in November, once in February. He came out of the churchyard, not the road. I didn't know him, but Mr. Vane did. You told Vane. Last March, he went white, told me the lessons were finished and I was to say nothing to nobody. Alderton paused, said it was a family matter and nothing to do with me, but he was frightened, properly frightened, not just surprised. This man you saw, describe him. Old, older than Vane, thin, walked with something wrong in his left leg. Not a limp exactly, more like he'd learned to correct for one. Military, I thought, the way he held himself, but rough, like someone who'd been a long time without a roof. Whimsy was very still. His face, did you see it clearly? Once. In February, under the Lichgate lamp, he was looking up at the tower. Alderton hesitated. I thought he looked like the war memorial. The photograph of it, I mean. There's one in the vestry, the young men from the parish. He stopped. He looked like one of them, except old. The morning sat quietly around them. A rook
Shipment arrives
complained
at midnight,
somewhere in the
Bunter.
elms.
Don't be late.
Mr.
I understand, sir.
Alderton, said Whimsy
The
at
local
last,
police are
and
already
his
asking
voice had
questions
shed
about
its
the
habitual
contents.
lightness as a tree sheds leaves. Gradually, then entirely, you have been very helpful. I must ask you one final thing, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. On Monday evening, the evening before Mr. Vane was found dead, did you see this man again? Alderton looked up. His face had the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been offered, with mixed feelings, the opportunity to set it down. He was at the gate, he said, Vane House gate, standing in the lane, watching the lights. Whimsy nodded once slowly. He picked picked up his cane and looked back toward the distant church tower, just visible above the tree line. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Go about your day, Mr. Alderton, and if anyone else comes to ask you these questions before I've finished with them, I'd be grateful if you found yourself suddenly very busy with that fence." Whimsy did not return to the inn. He sent Bunter ahead with instructions of the precise,
And the girl
unhurried
vanished the night
variety
before.
that implied the
Coincidence,
afternoon
Whimsy?
would be
I
eventful,
don't believe in coincidences.
and walked instead to the church, where he let himself into the nave with a key the vicar had provided, and sat alone in the front pew for 20 minutes, doing nothing that an observer would have recognized as thinking. Then he went up to the belfry. He examined the lancet window with a thoroughness that left no part of the stone surround uninspected. The ledge, the exterior sill, the iron weather staining on the
right,
inner
men, this is
face.
it.
He
Remember the
measured the
plan.
width of the
Let's go.
aperture with his hands, knuckle to knuckle, and stood for a long moment, looking out across the churchyard and the lane beyond, which wound east toward Alderton's farm, and further along, and invisible from this height, toward the coast. There was a coastal path. He had noted it on the ordnance map that morning. He came down from the belfry, locked the door behind him with the vicar's key, and walked to the vestry. The register lay where Bunter had replaced it. Whimsy opened it to Tuesday's entry and looked at it for the third time. Not at the handwriting, which he had already considered sufficiently, but at the time recorded for the start of practice. Not 9:45, written in the same dark ink that distinguished it from every surrounding entry. Every Tuesday for 31 years, the register showed Cornelius Vane had recorded his bell practice in a rust-brown ink that matched the aging of the pages. Tuesday last was written in black. Whimsy closed the register and went to find the vicar. He found him in the garden, in a state of distracted horticulture, pruning something that did not require pruning with the energy of a man who needs to be doing something with his hands. "The register," said Whimsy without preamble. "Tuesday's entry. Did Vane make it himself?" Phelps clipped a healthy branch. I assumed so. He always did. "Did you see him that morning? Before practice?" A pause in the clipping. "I saw him at 9 o'clock. He came to the vestry for the register. I thought he seemed resolved about something, as though he'd made a decision." "And after 9 o'clock? Did you see him go up to the belfry?" "I heard the bells at 9:45, as always." "You heard the bells," Whimsy said carefully. "You did not see Vane." The pruning shears descended very slowly. "No," said the vicar, with the voice of a man hearing his own words become significant for the first time. "I did not." Whimsy nodded. He looked across the garden wall toward the tower, solid and unhurried against the afternoon sky, and thought about bells, about how they carry the impression of a man without requiring the man himself, and how 31 years of punctual Tuesday practice creates, in a village of this size, something very close to an alibi for whoever rings them. "Vicar," he said at last, "I shall need the church this evening, between 10 and midnight. I would be grateful if you would ensure nobody else is present, and equally grateful if you would ask no questions about why." Phelps looked at him with the expression
With
of
all
a
due
man
respect,
who has spent his career
both know
administering
this
comfort to
situation is
people in
far more
extremity
complicated
and
than
has
the
just
official reports
recognized that
suggest.
he is himself in some variety of it.
Priority call for the secretary.
"Is it nearly
yes,
over?"
hold the
he
line.
asked
This is
quietly.
urgent.
"Yes," said Whimsy. "I rather think someone will ring the bells tonight who has not rung them in a very long time, and I intend to be there when he does." Whimsy
They
had
found her down by
expected
the
10,
docks, Whimsy.
or perhaps half past,
She's
and had
gone.
revised the estimate upward on the basis that a man who had spent 35 years being careful was unlikely to abandon the habit on the night it mattered most. He had positioned himself in the organ loft, where the shadows were absolute, and the sight lines to the belfry door were not. A circumstance he had remedied with a small mirror borrowed from the vestry and angled against the choir stall with a precision that would have impressed Bunter, who was stationed outside in the lane with instructions to observe but not to intercept. The church was cold and entirely dark, except for the faint luminescence of the west window, through which a half-moon contributed its opinion in a thin bluish bar across the nave. At 11 o'clock, the lancet window, visible from the organ loft if one knew precisely where to look, which Whimsy did, admitted with considerable difficulty and a patience that spoke of
Map shows
prior.
the route through the
Practice
south zone.
the upper
They moved
half
the
of a
prisoners
man.
tonight.
The lower half
I'll
followed.
get them out.
There
Be
was a
ready at the
sound of
rendezvous.
controlled breathing, the soft
here.
compression of
They've
old leather
expanded the
on
main
stone,
hangar
and
significantly.
then footsteps, careful,
Which means they're preparing
deliberate,
for a
with the
major offensive,
characteristic
Captain.
irregularity Alderton had described, descended the belfry stairs and crossed toward the bell ropes. Whimsy came down from the organ loft without a sound and stood in the nave. For a moment there was nothing but the dark and the breathing and the faint creak of the tower settling around them. Then the man at the ropes became aware that he was not alone. Not from any noise Whimsy made, but from that particular alteration in the quality of a silence that occurs when it is shared. He turned. In the thin moonlight, he was exactly as Alderton had described. Old, thin, the posture of a soldier worn into something harder and less formal by long exposure to conditions that had nothing to do with parade grounds. His face was Cornelius Vane's face in the way that a winter tree is the same tree as in summer. The structure identical, the aspect entirely altered by what had been stripped away. "George Vane," said Whimsy quietly. The man said nothing. He held one of the remaining bell ropes loosely in his right hand. Not with any threatening intent, Whimsy thought, but in the manner of a man who has come to a place that means something to him and requires something solid to hold. "You rang the bells on Tuesday morning," Whimsy said. "Not Cornelius, you. The register entry was made the previous evening in anticipation. Cornelius wrote it himself, which is why the handwriting matches. But Cornelius was dead before 9:45. You rang the bells to establish that the morning was normal, to give the impression of a living man going about his living routine." George Vane looked at him for a long moment with eyes that had seen a quantity of things Whimsy did not intend to catalogue. "He was my brother," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who has spoken English for 35 years through other languages and has not
Local
quite
police are
recovered
already
the
asking
original
questions about
cadence.
the contents.
"I know," said Whimsy. "He was going to tell her, Helena. He'd found me, hired the man in London to find me, and he was going to tell her I was alive after 35 years. He paused. "Do you understand what that would have done? It would have dissolved the trust," Whimsy said. "She would have lost the house. She would have lost everything. Her life, what she'd built on what she believed." He set the rope down with a deliberateness that was almost ceremonial. "I let them think I was dead because it was the only thing I could give her after what I'd done. Going, leaving her. I had my reasons for not coming back, and they were not good ones, and I have lived with that." He looked up at the bells, invisible in the darkness above. "Cornelius found me, wrote to me, said he intended to do what was right, legally and morally." The last two words carried a bitterness refined by decades. He always did know what was right. "And you killed him for it," said Whimsy,
The crates
without
arrived this
inflection.
morning.
"I
And the
came
girl
to stop
vanished
him."
the night before.
George Vane's voice did
Coincidence,
not
Whimsy?
change.
I don't believe
He
in
wouldn't be
coincidences,
stopped.
Inspector.
The silence that followed was of the particular variety that churches seem to cultivate. Not empty, but accumulated, as though the building had been storing the weight of difficult conversations for 9 centuries and had grown accustomed to the load. Whimsy did not move. He stood in the nave with his hands in his coat pockets and his hat in neither, having left it somewhere in the organ loft, and
All right, man,
regarded
this is it.
George Vane
Remember the
with the
plan.
expression he
Let's
reserved
go.
for things that were both inevitable and sad, which was not contrary to what Gregson might have supposed, an expression he wore infrequently. "Tell me about the rope," he said. George Vane sat down on the chancel step with the heaviness of a man whose legs have made a unilateral decision. "I came the night before, Monday night. I'd come several times. You know that, I think. I knew the window, I knew the tower." He looked at his hands, I cut the rope then, prepared it, I thought. He stopped. Begin again. I thought if I confronted him without it being planned, I would lose my nerve. 35 years is a long time to be a ghost. You forget how to insist upon things. He let you in on Tuesday morning. He was expecting me. He'd left the key in the lock inside as a signal. We had arrangements, small ones from childhood. He knew I'd come. A pause. He was not surprised. I think he was relieved, actually. Cornelius always preferred things to be direct. It was his great failing. And when he wouldn't be dissuaded, he said Helena was owed the truth, that she had built her life on a legal fiction, and that he would not allow it to continue. George Vane's voice was even, not calm, Whimsy thought, but exhausted into something that resembled calm. He said I could tell her myself, or he would do it for me. He gave me until the end of the week, but you didn't believe him. I believed he meant it. I didn't believe I could bear it. He looked up. I am not asking you to find that reasonable. I don't find it reasonable, said Whimsy quietly. I find it human, which is rather worse. Outside, an owl made its assessment of the night and fell silent. The moonlight had shifted during the conversation, and now lay across the chancel floor in a longer, thinner bar, as though the church itself were measuring something. What happens now? Said George Vane. Now, said Whimsy. Bunter comes in from the lane. Inspector Gregson arrives, as I took the liberty of telephoning him at 9 o'clock this evening. You will be taken in, charged and tried, and 12 people considerably less perceptive than either of us will decide what your 35 years of voluntary absence is worth against what you did on Tuesday morning. George Vane nodded slowly. And Helena? Whimsy was quiet for a moment. The trust, he said, was predicated on a presumption of death which was, it transpires, incorrect. Its legal status is now a matter for people with considerably more patience for paperwork than I possess. But I will say this.
Ambassador,
he paused.
we both know this
there are
situation is
aspects
far
of this
more
matter which
complicated
bear
than the
upon
official
motive and
reports suggest.
history that a competent barrister will
Priority
find
call to the
relevant,
secretary.
and which
Yes,
may
hold the line,
persuade
this is
the
urgent.
relevant authorities that Mrs. Helena Vane's situation warrants consideration.
My God.
It was not a promise.
could you
George
possibly
Vane did
know
not
that?
take it as one. He
Where
took
is
it,
she?
Whimsy thought, as the thing it was,
found
a
her down by the
small
docks,
and carefully
Whimsy.
rationed mercy
She's gone.
extended by a man who disapproved of the crime and understood the criminal, which is a distinction that sounds simpler than it is. The vestry door opened. Bunter entered with a lantern, and the quiet competence of a man who has waited in a lane for 2 hours and found it entirely unremarkable. Behind him came Gregson, large and constabulary, his expression that of a man who has just discovered his promising suspect was insufficiently promising after all, and has arrived at the correct conclusion by a route he does not entirely follow. George Vane stood. He straightened, and for a moment the 35 years fell away from his posture, and he was briefly, unmistakably, a soldier. Which was, Whimsy reflected, both the most and the least useful thing he had ever been.